Hello and welcome back to the IBS Freedom Podcast, your favorite podcast. I mean, I'm making an assumption, but it's pretty awesome. So I think it's a safe assumption to say that we have your favorite podcast here. As always, I am joined by the wonderful and notably pregnant Miss Amy Hollenkamp, R to the D.
Hello.
Amy, tell the good listeners at home why I immediately brought up the fact that you're pregnant.
Well, it goes with the topic today. We're going to be covering, child gut health, children's microbiome, things to consider.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of, we'll probably touch on, generally what kind of things can you do to help with build up a good microbiome for a child and to instill good gut health in a child. And then also we can probably cover some bases as to if your child is having gut issues, what kind of interventions might make more sense. I know I've had some children clients, and again, I always sort of take a little bit more of a gentle approach versus some of the aggressive stuff that you tend to see in adults. And we probably are overly aggressive in adults, and I'm just extra cautious to avoid any sort of aggressive type strategies that could be problematic in
Children
a kid
are
who's
not just tiny adults.
right.
And they don't just need the same intervention, but with tiny child-sized doses. There's more to it than that, oftentimes.
Right. But yeah, I think this will be a really fun topic, just because there's different avenues that we could go down and discuss.
Yeah. And I think maybe the best starting point is let's talk about what is normal. What would be the ideal scenario for a kiddo from, the moment they're conceived, ready to go. Put you on the spot.
Right. Well,
let's walk through how we can set up the microbiome and the gut to be healthy. Let's start with pregnancy. So maybe share some stuff that you're thinking about or you're doing, and then we'll talk about childbirth, breastfeeding, early childhood, and we'll kind of run through what is the ideal scenario for each of these phases.
Yeah, and I know prior to us jumping on the call, I was mentioning a book called The Good Gut by Justin Sonnenberg and his wife. I cannot remember her name, which is terrible. I think her name's Erica, actually. Mm-hmm. Erica Sonnenberg. So they're a microbiome scientist duo. I think they're out in California. They might be at Stanford or UCLA, one of the California schools.
Yeah.
But they're big on microbiome research. But their book's really interesting because they talk a lot about what happens to your own microbiome during pregnancy, but also how, the birthing process can lead to microbiome changes, and then thereafter with breastfeeding, how that changes a child's microbiome. But one thing that they mentioned that was so interesting, and I'll have to see if I can pull it up and maybe we can quote it. But there was, in that book, it's really interesting. So at some point in pregnancy, I feel like it's in second or third trimester, the microbiome of the mother shifts to look more like what's typically seen in populations that are obese or overweight. So they're extracting more calories from the food they're taking in. So there tends to be this marked shift in later pregnancy where microbiome's shifting to maybe extract more calories from the food that you're eating, which makes sense.
It does. That's really freaky that happens. But yeah, it makes sense because, and I don't know if I shared this with you already, just in our own back and forth, you'll gain weight through, trimester 2. You'll start to notice that you have a belly and you're starting to put on some weight. But the last month or so of the pregnancy, it's pretty normal to put on a pound a week.
Right.
So it's really, really accelerated later on in pregnancy. So it's probably what you're talking about. Because if you think about it, at least for me, when I was pregnant with my daughter, I don't think that I was eating a lot more food in the third trimester versus the second trimester.
Right.
I didn't even feel like I was eating a ton more food in general throughout my pregnancy, but I didn't really notice, an increase in appetite through the third trimester, but all of a sudden you're gaining so much more weight, and it would make sense if the microbiome shifts to allow you to extract more more calories and more nutrition from your food.
Yeah, and the wildest part about the whole thing is that generally prior to birth, the microbiome reverts back to more of like what the microbiome was like prior to that shift. So, like, essentially in that book, they talk about there's this period where the microbiome goes into, like, calorie extracting phase, and then prior to the birth, the microbiome shifts back towards, like, it's more of the normal. And they kind of think that that's really profound and interesting because it's almost like, you know, some of the microbial shifts, they sort of want the baby to inherit some of that, like, from the mom. So it reverts back to more of the environment that was fostered the healthier microbiome. It's very strange. And again, I don't necessarily remember all the ins and outs of that. Yeah. But I just remember when I was reading that being like, oh my God, that's so interesting that there seems to be these weird shifts during different parts of pregnancy. It's kind of amazing to think that there's some level of precision in your body's helping you. And it could be kind of going along with different hormonal shifts that are happening too. But
it's amazing or creepy. One or the other. I could go with both, but like the microbes are reading our minds, reading our bodies, and anticipating things with us.
Yeah.
Kind of Twilight Zone-ish.
Well, and I think that there's generally a symbiotic relationship. So, like, if they're trying to help us in some way, and then we help them, if we're transitioning, they probably want to transition too. Yeah. Both to help them and probably to help us. So there's the whole I'll scratch your back, you scratch my back type relationship there. But I think in terms of like what I'm doing in pregnancy is really just trying to keep my microbiome happy, healthy, making sure that I'm going regularly. Again, I think constipation tends to be a pretty common symptom during pregnancy. My sister struggled a lot with constipation during pregnancy. I haven't had too much of that, which is good. But again, I'd be curious to kind of see, because I'm very aware typically of around how many calories I'm eating each day. Not necessarily tracking at this point. I can just sort of gauge where I'm at. And like,
you have a sixth sense now.
Right. Like, I'm kind of curious. I don't want to biohack it too much. Like, because you'll drive yourself crazy. But it'll be kind of interesting, like, how my weight gain slates. My sister didn't gain really any weight until her 20th week. And then she I think, she gained like 30-ish pounds. So, like, she was really packing it on the last 20 weeks of pregnancy. So it'll be interesting. I haven't really gained much weight. I'm into, like, my 16 and a half-ish week. Okay. Your body changes, which is weird. Like, it looks like I've gained some weight because your body just changes, and you're like, oh, this is shape. Like, right? It's like, oh, the shape. Like, I have a little bit of a bump, but like, so I keep being like, oh, I know I'm gaining weight, so I probably check like once a week. I'm not that big on like weighing myself all the time. I'm not super like regimented about that, but I'm like, oh, I look like I've gained some weight, and I'll hop on the scale and be like, no, I haven't. Like, this is so weird. I'm like, because it looks like it, but I haven't. It's weird.
Yeah. I don't know at what point it was for me. I know. Yeah, I know that I was gaining a lot of weight towards the end, and I remember the midwife saying that was normal, that you should be putting on like a pound a day at that point, or not a pound a day, a pound a week. So yeah, it's interesting, and I think for me, like, nutritionally, I'm going to throw out the idea of food allergies and how the tone, the conversation, revolving around food allergies has totally taken a 180. Like, for a little while there, we were saying, oh my God, avoid the allergens, avoid the peanuts, avoid the whatever, and delay giving your baby peanuts and peanut butter and wheat, and delay giving them all those things because it could mean that they have an allergy. And now the research is starting to show more. No, actually, if you educate the baby's immune system, either in utero or after birth, if they kind of have that little bit of stimulation And that reminder of like, oh, hey, here's some peanut butter. Oh, hey, here's some wheat. It actually educates their immune system and teaches the immune system to not freak out, which is what we ultimately want. So I know, like, for me, I tried to eat all the things to the degree that was possible for me. So, like, I made a point to eat, like, different nuts and seeds and peanuts, eggs, soy, corn, whatever. For me, I just knew that I would feel like crap if I ate gluten or dairy, so I couldn't do that. But I tried to eat everything else under the sun during the pregnancy. And then likewise, when we were introducing foods, which we'll get to a little bit later, I did make a point to make some of the quote unquote allergenic foods some of the first introductions that we made. Maybe not the first, but it was within the first couple of months that we were introducing foods.
Right. My sister's going through that, or I think recently went through that process with her baby, who's about a year. He's a little over a year now, but I remember her being like, we're trying peanut butter today, and like, I think she even ordered like some sort of testing kit or like, intro kit. I guess they have those now. Who knows? But they kind of portioned everything out to like titrate up.
I feel like you could do that yourself.
Right.
I feel like I wouldn't spend the money on it, but
well,
there's weirder things people spend money on, so I'm not going to knock it.
Well, I think too there's like some weirder ones like shellfish, or like if you're not necessarily making a bunch of stuff. I don't know. Well, I don't remember exactly what it was, but I remember her doing like some sort of like pouches where it's like, okay, introduce this at a certain time, and then it probably overcomplicated it a little bit, but well,
I guess if you yourself don't eat the things, then like if like the parents had an allergy or a sensitivity or a disliking of like shellfish and you didn't want to stink up your whole house cooking shellfish, then I could that would make some sense to me. Or like if somebody in the house was a celiac and you really didn't want to cook wheat and dirty up the kitchen with wheat, then I could see maybe getting like a product and doing it that way. But to each their own.
Well, and I think again, like from and I could be remembering wrong too. I just, again, there's so many little weird packets of food that they have as, like, babies. But I think, you're correct. Probably eating diversity of food during pregnancy would affect tolerance and immune tolerance to things post birth, like when the child's actually here. And then probably incorporating foods in earlier rather than delaying them would be better from an immune system standpoint. That's where things are going in that direction now. Like, I think generally they're saying we've kind of created peanut allergies more so than prevented them from a lot of the delaying strategies. But I think that there's a lot that happens with childbirth as well. And again, they talk about this in the book too. I think the main things there would be like the delivery process. So is the baby born vaginally compared to cesarean section? And that's going into this with the idea that like some C-sections are very, very necessary. So again, sometimes this is just sort of like a crapshoot where if the baby's meant to come out vaginally, it's going to come out vaginally, and if the baby's meant to come out cesarean, it's going to come out cesarean. I think, again, from the microbiome standpoint, it's probably more optimal, and probably from a recovery standpoint, to do vaginally, and I think doctors would agree on that, but there are scenarios where it's a little bit tricky. My sister's scenario is a perfect example. She had a C-section. She was in labor for a very long time. She was fully dilated, but the baby, like, I think my nephew's head was just too big. He was like 96th percentile for head, and like his rest of his body was like 25th or 30th. So he had like just a giant head that was not like coming through the canal. Like the
baby.
Right, the doctor was like, this baby is stuck. Like, this baby is literally stuck. It's not coming out. So she's definitely in the percentage where I think, like, it was certainly necessary for her to do a C-section. But
that's different than, like,
schedule.
I think that, I think, like, I don't know if this is technically what they're called, but, like, the vanity C-sections where women are like, I don't want to change any of the lady bits down there, so I'd rather have a planned C-section. Like, that's kind of a different world versus if you really need to do it. Did I ever tell you that I was, like, this close to a C-section with my daughter? Oh my God.
Yeah.
And I might have told this before, but I'll reiterate it again. The only reason I pushed that kid out vaginally is because, I kid you not, they picked some 12-year-old off the street and told her, here, put these scrubs on, tell this lady that you're a surgeon, and tell her that you're going to cut into her body. And I don't know where they picked this prepubescent doctor from, but the 12-year-old telling me about the informed consent and having me sign on the dotted line to consent to the surgical procedure scared the willikers out of me. And that's the only reason I think I pushed her out vaginally, because we were right there. I had been pushing for 5 hours. We were all thrown in the towel at that point. And then I saw that damn surgeon, and something deep inside of me said, oh, hell no. I'm not going to be your first cut, little prepubescent surgeon, middle school girl. She looked so young. Oh my gosh. So that I'm grateful to that child surgeon, though.
Well, and again, I think, it's something that I certainly would prefer a vaginal delivery going into it, but you just never know. So you kind of have to prepare mentally for all scenarios. But I think when I've done research, the WHO the World Health Organization has stated that, or at least this is what I remember from the stats, so don't quote me, but it's like 10% of deliveries probably need a C-section. So, which is a decent portion. It's not like a small portion, but I think they said here in the States, it's closer to a third that get C-sections. So it's like, again, I think that there's potentially a blend of different reasons why that's a little bit higher. I think sometimes there's scheduling conflicts at the hospital with, like, timings of different things. Like, certain hospitals, it's really high. So, like, the C-section rate is, like, 80%. And you're like, well, what's going on at these hospitals?
And you can ask clinics. You can ask OB offices and clinics and birth centers and hospitals. You can just ask them what their rate of C-section is. And they can tell you that. I remember asking the birth center here what their C-section rate was. Like, obviously, you would have to be transferred from the birth center to the hospital, and then get the C-section at the hospital. But I remember it was very low, which I was happy about. Because it does make you wonder, like, the hospitals where it's like an 80% occurrence. It's like, whoa, what's going on there, man? Like,
well, clearly. And again, I think that there's probably a lot of different confounding variables there, where, like, sometimes if you're overbooked and you can't play out I mean, this is the bad scenario, not great from the patient's perspective, but I think that there's different scenarios where maybe C-sections are sort of pushed more than the vaginal. I would say that's a good idea to ask the place where I'm gonna go get my care from. I'll ask the doctor. I have an appointment next week about C-section rate at the hospital. But I think that they're probably overused, whether it's vanity or not. But again, there's certainly scenarios, and I never want to say, like, there are not scenarios where it's 100% necessary for the health of the child and the mom. So, but go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was going to share at least one. This is just one story that I'm familiar with, but a friend of mine is a physician assistant, and she was doing a residency in OBGYN, and she was delivering babies. She was working at a hospital in California. And during her residency, she did her residency the same year that I was pregnant with my daughter. And I remember, like, messaging her when I had questions about stuff, and one of the things she shared with me, she said she literally, like, a woman was in labor, and then outside of the hospital room, like, the doctor or whoever it was, the obstetrician, literally like told the nurse or told the PA or whoever, like, I think I'm gonna like we need to encourage her to get a C-section because I have a golf game that I need to get to.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
how is this legal? But like she was like, I thought that was, you know, a made up scenario that I would never see. And it was like her first month of her residency, and she saw the OB tell the nurse or tell the whoever, like, we need to hurry her along. We need to encourage her to get a C-section because I have a golf game at 3.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, that's probably the absolute worst case scenario for a golf game. But I'd imagine, like, for, and again, I don't think this is the case for all, like, singular physicians, but I think sometimes when physicians are working on their own and there's, like, only one person or something that needs to be at the hospital, there could be more scheduling conflicts than others. Like, I know the group that I'm going to, you kind of don't know which doctor you're going to get, so you meet them all, like, prior. And I am encouraged how much they tried for Katie to have the vaginal delivery, so, like, that's reassuring. I mean, she was in labor for, like, a day and a half, essentially, like, just a very long period of time. So, but yeah, I think that it's an interesting, like, scenario where there could be ethical issues. There could be money. Some people argue that there's a money component because they make more money on C-sections compared to vaginal deliveries.
Yeah.
Which, again, I don't think inherently doctors are thinking that way, but there could be some sort of subconscious or, like, pressure.
Or, like, hospital policies are set a certain way to encourage it. Yeah.
Right. So, again, I'm not necessarily, like, a huge think that there's tons of malintent, like, from the doctor, but, you know, there could be different policies that sort of lean that way.
I guess kind of the take-home point maybe is to be your own advocate.
Right.
And keep your wits about you. Like, again, like, you can ask about their C-section rates, and if it's something higher than the national average, I would highly suggest that you find a different obstetrician or group to work with, or a different hospital. You know, it's like you could do your due diligence and try to find the stuff out so that when you get to the hospital, you're not in a pickle and then at the mercy of whatever. Because I'll tell you what, like, childbirth is no joke. I went in and I thought too, I was like, all right, baby, I'm a chiropractor. I got adjusted. Like, my pelvis is all, like, aligned, and I got acupuncture and chiropractic. I was eating my dates. I was having I don't remember what the tea was, but I was making a tea in giant batches and drinking it. I think maybe raspberry or something. Raspberry, I don't even know. I don't know anymore. But I was drinking the hippy dippy tea, and I was doing the dates, and I was like, I got chiropractic, I got acupuncture, I'm 6 feet tall, and I've got hips. I was like, I've got good birth and hips, and I can squat this kid out the old-fashioned way. I don't need nothing. And, man, even with all that stuff, this childbirth thing was no joke.
Right.
And you don't want to be making decisions when you're in that much pain, and you don't want to be trying to advocate for yourself in the heat of the moment when you're in that much pain.
Right.
Do all the legwork ahead of time. Like, schedule stuff, ask the questions, make the plan, do all the things way ahead of time. And that way, by the time you're actually in labor, it's not like you're in 10 out of 10 pain and you're trying to, like, use your brain to think about a decision. Because it won't work, I guarantee.
Well, and you could probably even have a discussion with your doctor, again, from an advocating for yourself standpoint of, like, you know, like, I'm someone that wants to avoid a C-section as much as possible. Obviously, there's scenarios where it makes total sense, but even kind of putting that in the mind of the physician or the group that you're working with would probably have them try different things more so compared to just jumping on the train right away. And again, maybe that makes sense to jump on the train right away, but at least having the conversation.
Yeah, at least expressing your preference. Certainly.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, but I think the reason we're talking about C-sections versus vaginal is that, you know, as the baby comes out of the birth canal is sort of where it's being, like its first go round with microbes is shooting out that birth canal from a variety of different sources, from the vaginal canal. I think in the book they even argue,
probiotic.
yeah, in the book they argue that there's probably even like some stool or fecal that they get kind of hit with within the mix of childbirth. So again, there's just they basically get soaked with microbes right when they're coming out of the birth canal.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily get that with C-section babies. And one thing I have heard too, like, let's say, some people are like, well, maybe that's not a bad thing. I've heard some people argue that, where it's like, well, if the mom has a bad bug or something in their vaginal canal, there could be negatives of having the baby come vaginally compared to cesarean section, which again, I don't know how you necessarily, if you could argue that or not. I think what generally the studies are saying is that typically if the baby comes out of the vaginal canal, they have more of the beneficial microbes and less of the proteotype bacteria, whereas if they've come out of C-section, they have more proteobacteria and less of like lactobacillus, bifido type bugs. So that's the general. Also, go ahead.
I've read also that with C-section births, the baby's microbiome, at least initially, is much closer in resemblance to the skin microbiome.
Right.
Right? Because that makes sense. Like, the baby was being handled, with gloves on, but nonetheless, like, being handled with hands and coming through an opening that was made in the skin. Like, and maybe the point is maybe they come out and they're relatively sterile, but then they're put on the mother's chest, or they're kissed, or whatever, like they're getting touched. So it's like baby's first probiotic can come from being bathed in the microbes from the vaginal canal, or all of the touching and all of the hands and the skin contact, and then that's what they end up taking in for more of the microbiome. And I'll share too, for what it's worth, like, there's zero mom guilt and judgment on this podcast. We should have said that at the beginning of the episode, because honestly, like, I was a C-section baby, and I think I'm doing pretty okay. I mean, my microbiome could use some TLC. I'm not going to lie. Like, I've done a lot of stool testing on myself, but how much of that is because I was a C-section baby versus the boatloads of antibiotics I had as a kid? I don't know. But, I don't begrudge my mom and dad for having a C-section. My mom's case, like, it was a very necessary C-section. So it is what it is. I think I'm reasonably healthy, all things considered. But it's like, I know it's just, I have this like little nugget of awareness that maybe my microbiome needs just that little bit of extra TLC that somebody who was born vaginally might not need quite that degree of TLC. I don't know. I think much more about the antibiotics I had in childhood rather than the way I was delivered, honestly. I think that's a much bigger culprit for me.
Well, and I think it's such a good point. Like, these are just singular variables. It doesn't mean that, like, your baby's doomed if you had a C-section from a microbiome standpoint. There's a lot you can do to... I know in the Good Gut book, they kind of talk about all these phases, which it's a really good overview, I think, of, like, how the microbiome develops, like, both kind of how it changes in pregnancy, how the baby comes out, affects things. But that couple actually had C-section babies. So they kind of talk about their experience with it, and they sort of recommend, which again, I just can't imagine asking a doc this, but to like soak a sponge in like the mom's vagina and then like layer it on the baby's face. So like I can't imagine like if you asked a doctor them doing that, but who knows. But that was kind of their preference, is like, okay, you could still sort of inoculate. They didn't end up doing that, but they did have like baby probiotics that they tried to give the child. They had kind of some different strategies to try to mitigate any negative effects of the C-section compared to vaginal. But again, I think you're dead on. There's so many other factors that, you could dial up other strategies. Maybe this is like a potentially negative affecting thing on the microbiome, but there's so many other positive things that you could add to the bucket. it's not, again, a dooming thing or, again, something that you should feel shame about if you have had a C-section versus vaginal delivery. I think you can have a perfectly healthy, happy child with either delivery. It's just a variable, really.
Yeah, it's just one part of the equation.
Right.
And similarly, like, I'll kind of open the floor for the next phase of things since we're going in this timeline sequence. The next variable that gets talked a lot about is whether or not you were breastfed as a baby.
Yep.
And I just want to preface this section of the conversation again by saying zero mom guilt, zero judgment, because honest to God, hopefully I'm not like traumatizing you before you have your baby.
No, you aren't. You aren't. I've heard it all from my sister too, so.
Okay. Childbirth was to hell and back. For me, personally, breastfeeding was worse. Like, I would give birth again, and I was like a hair away from a C-section. But the breastfeeding was so hard for me, and there's so much that could go wrong that I never knew. I just thought, which is weird. Okay, let me talk about my brain lesion. So I work in a field like you where we find people's bodies going hangwire all the time. And we find that different body systems need support, like the immune system, the hormones, the gut, the brain, the whatever. But for some reason, I had this blinder on where I naively assumed that boobs magically figured out how to work and they magically knew how to breastfeed a baby, and that was the end of the story. So I never really thought much about, should I be concerned about this? Is this going to be hard? I just thought, like, okay, if you decide to breastfeed, you slap the baby out of the boob, they get the milk out of the boob, and then bada bing, bada boom, you're breastfeeding. Cool for you, man. No. There's so much. Like, for me, I never made enough milk. I made maybe like a third of what my daughter needed. And there were so many sleepless nights. I was killing myself trying to pump like every hour, pumping like a crazy person. I was getting, you can actually get donor milk, like women who make too much breast milk and have a really big freezer stash sometimes will donate breast milk to people who don't make enough. So I actually was getting donated breast milk from other women to supplement what I was able to produce. I was researching herbs. I drank a beer. And I hate beer and I hate bitter things. I drank a disgusting beer because somebody somewhere said that hops could help you make more milk. So I thought, what the heck? I guess I'm going to have to be a beer drinker now. I tried everything I could possibly think of. And nada. And it was really upsetting because I wanted to be like the hippy dippy natural crunchy mama who breastfed until my kid was 20. Right? Like I was totally into that idea, but it just wasn't that way for me. A good friend of mine, she had an oversupply issue where she had like the wonder boobs that made milk like a champion, but it was really painful. And she actually had to do things to try to slow down her milk production because she was in so much pain and she got mastitis a bunch of times. Yeah. And then she had an infection in her nipple. So anyway. Right. Again, the variable of whether your child was breastfed or not. There's so many variables. I would say, I think that it's wonderful if you could try to breastfeed. And I think that the research is there. It is better for the microbiome if the child is breastfed. But don't absolutely kill yourself in the process, and don't torture yourself trying to breastfeed and struggle to the degree that like I did, for example. Because honest to God, like I should have cut myself some slack, and I probably should have just said, all right, I'm going to supplement with some formula and it's not the end of the world. And I'm going to produce what I can produce and that's the end of that. But I was breaking my body just trying to get every drop of milk out of those glands, and it just, it was rough. Yeah, I think, again, there can be a plethora of different things that happen. Again, the baby sometimes doesn't latch properly, and so there can be issues there. I think my sister, similar to you, kind of struggled a little bit
But her, like, Teddy wouldn't typically, latch, so we only wanted a bottle. So, like, there was issues with that. So there was just all these little hiccups that made it a little bit more challenging for sure. And she supplemented with formula, and it was like, oh, it was just like a sigh of relief. And I think that there's like an aspect of it, like what you're describing, when the stress that the breastfeeding is creating is to a level that's counterproductive. Like, the baby's probably feeling the stress too. If they're hungry and they're not getting what they want or need, again, like, there's a level of stress there's so much stress on the mom, like, it just makes the whole situation worse. So yeah, I think that, again, there could certainly be some breastfeeding issues for sure. And again, you don't want to kill yourself trying to breastfeed.
It's wonderful if you could do it, but
right.
Yeah, and I did, I continued to breastfeed her to some extent for the first year of her life, but I think I legit tortured myself for about 6 months, and then after that point, I started to chill just a little bit. It's, and one of the reasons that breastfeeding is wonderful for the baby is that it has some oligosaccharides. It has some prebiotics in the breast milk that help feed the good microbes. It helps feed bifidobacterium especially. So, but I'll throw this out there as another for instance. And again, I only have so many data points to go off of. So I was a C-section baby, but I was breastfed for about 6 months until apparently I bit my mom's nipple. And like the first tooth I got in, I bit her nipple. And the way she describes it, she'll say, the milk was just gone. She was like, I tried to pump. I tried to do everything. I was hydrating. I was doing all the things. And the day you bit my nipple, it was like, nope, it's gone.
Yeah.
My body was so traumatized from that I just could not produce anymore. So then they had to transition me to formula. But, I was breastfed for a decent chunk of time. And then, of course, I had the truckload of antibiotics in my childhood. But I have hardly any bifidobacteria. And again, I attribute that more to the antibiotics. My husband, vaginal delivery, breastfed for only 2 weeks, no antibiotics, hardly at all, in his childhood. Astonishing, beautiful levels of bifido. Like, I envy his bifido. Mine is like 0.0 something% on 16S testing.
Right.
His was like 7% bifido on 16S testing.
Gosh.
It was wild. And, it's like, okay, well, clearly there's other stuff that can keep your bifidobacteria healthy and happy, because he was only breastfed for 2 weeks. And he's got amazing bifido levels still into his mid-30s. Who knew?
Right. These are variables for sure. And again, I think the degree of which you're probably taking antibiotics, especially early on in life, in the period, probably between the ages of like birth to 5 years old. And it's not to say that antibiotics can't be very necessary, but I think, again, like, the degree of which we over-medicate, too, is just so high that it takes a toll. Again, that's what I think a big factor for me. I get ear infections, strep throat, multiple times. Like, I probably had 1 ear infection in strep throat every year from the age of, like, 2 to 15. And it's like, if you're having so much of that throughout time and you're just constantly taking antibiotics. I took a lot of antibiotics even as a baby as well. I think I had an ear infection that like wasn't going away, and it probably was like not bacterial in nature, and they were just like, we're gonna keep trying stuff. But I remember I have some like white stains on my teeth from some of the antibiotics that they gave, and my mom always like would say, oh, some of the antibiotics stained your teeth, but she would even acknowledge, oh my gosh, like the degree of antibiotics probably played a role. And again, it's not to say never give antibiotics to your child, but it's more, you want to use antibiotics wisely and do other things to mitigate the factors of antibiotics. Again, these are all variables. It's not to say that if you take an antibiotics that your microbiome's screwed, or again, if you're a C-section baby, you're screwed. It's like, these aren't what you should be pulling from this. It's more, these are variables, and you want to stack the odds in your favor, and there's some of these things that are totally out of your control, and you don't want to get, like, wrapped up or feel guilty or shame yourself if there's things that are out of your control, but there's so much that is in your control, especially when you're kind of working on building up the kids' microbiome.
Yeah, and it's there's so many moving parts. There's so many variables throughout your child's lifetime. I don't think any one piece of the puzzle is like the whole picture.
Right.
You know, what your child is eating, like their environment, like from a psychological perspective, like how are they in a loving, nurturing environment? Is there any like trauma or abuse or something like that? Like even that can play such a huge role in a child's health, let alone the microbiome stuff. So it's not to say this is the be all end all, but and I'll say too, this is a plug for what I think we've kind of shared over the last 75 or whatever episodes of this podcast, is that I don't think it serves anybody to be the person who's like all conventional medicine all the time and the natural stuff is bullshit and I'm just going to take my drugs and be happy with my drugs. Like, I don't think that serves anybody. But I also don't think that being on the other extreme serves anybody, where you're like, I'm not going to take any prescription ever. I'm going to deny medical care. I'm going to cure everything with essential oils and frolic off into the rainbows and eat organic, and therefore I'm going to be fine. Like, I don't think that serves anybody either. It's like, why don't we meet somewhere in the middle? So, for example, just realistically, sometimes you need a C-section.
Right.
It is what it is. It's surgery. It's not ideal, but it is what it is. I would rather have it, I would rather be here in 2022 and get a C-section rather than living in the 1700s and not have a C-section available and have the mom die.
Right.
Because sometimes that's what it ends up being, is that the mom dies in childbirth because they could not get a C-section. So I would much rather have access to the life-saving C-sections in this day and age. Just don't overuse them. Right. And likewise, there are just some women who cannot breastfeed or they cannot fully breastfeed. And it is what it is. Like, you've just got to make the best of the situation and the cards that you're dealt, try to do the best you can and make up for that in other ways. But I think, to the point earlier, sometimes it's just a matter of awareness too, and like knowing about some tips and tricks and stuff. Right. So like for me, I was this chronic ear infection kid. In retrospect, I look back and I realize I think a really big part of it for me is I think I was dairy intolerant from birth. Because, again, I was the Haagen-Dazs kid. Right. So I was completely sustained in utero on Haagen-Dazs ice cream. So I just think that my little body was like, I'm good now. We've had all the dairy we need. We're set for a life now. And I swear to God, I think I just popped out of the womb intolerant to dairy on some level. Not breast milk, but like cow's milk. So like if I could go back to 1986 and tell my parents, hey, just try not to give her dairy, see what happens. Right. I really am curious what would have happened. The other thing too that I think a lot of people don't know about is that chiropractic is like borderline miraculous for children. So if you have a baby that won't latch properly, sometimes that's because they have a restricted neck or a subluxated neck and they can't physically turn their head into the proper position to latch correctly. And oftentimes, like babies who struggle with colic or reflux or constipation or who can't latch properly, you take that baby to a pediatric trained chiropractor and get them some gentle chiropractic adjustments. Night and day difference.
Oh my gosh.
Huge. And again, like, I wish I knew that, because thinking about it even from this perspective, I don't know, like, whether or not chiropractic like boosts the immune system or any of that, I'll kind of table that conversation because I think that that might happen, but I'm not very well versed in the science of that.
Right.
But even like the neck and the spine in the neck, the cervical spine is so close to the eustachian tubes that drain the ears. What if all of those ear infections were because I had a restricted neck because I was a C-section baby? Or, you know, heck, vaginal birth babies can have subluxations and restrictions too. But like, I wonder what would my life have been like if my parents knew to take me to a pediatric chiropractor and maybe cut dairy back out of my diet. Like, that could have made such a world of difference, but nobody knew about dairy intolerance back then. Not really. And nobody knew about pediatric chiropractic. A lot of people don't know that there are pediatric chiropractors. Or like difficulty with latching, like maybe the baby has a tongue tie. And I know for me, like my daughter was tongue tied, and we went to a pediatrician, a midwife, and not one but two lactation consultants, and they all said, no, she's not tongue tied. It took going to a lactation consultant who specifically specializes in tongue tie and evaluating for tongue tie to actually get that correct diagnosis. So, you know, it's like, but you don't know that until you go through this stuff. So similarly, like, I wish I knew that. I wish I had taken our daughter to that lactation consultant right out the get-go, because then, you know, I made a third of the milk that she needed to consume. Maybe I would have made half. Maybe I would have made more. There's some stuff with my own physiology and my own anatomy that I think was at play as well. But I just wonder if I could have maximized my production if we had gotten the tongue tie taken care of sooner. But we didn't get it done until she was 9 months old.
Right. Well, and I think all this stuff, it's so interesting to think back, like, hindsight's always 20/20. But even the antibiotic stuff, too. Like, back in the 90s, the antibiotics were just, like, they were awesome, you know, just give the antibiotic. Like, there was no downsides. There was no downsides to taking antibiotics. So I could, sometimes my mom, I know, like, is like, oh, I feel so bad. Like, we gave all those antibiotics. I'm like, why? You guys didn't know. Like, you guys were taking care of me the best that you knew how. But yeah, I think that there's just, we don't know certain things, and we'll probably learn different things over time that we don't know now. And it's just, we have to continue learning. But I think it's interesting you mentioned the child chiropractor. Again, the adjustments look really cute. Like, I've seen them in videos when, you know, they're doing it to a little nugget baby. But yeah, I think it's interesting that those seem to be really valuable, and there could be kind of some nervous system structural type benefits of doing chiropractic based work. I think, you know, I know we were talking about like introductions of foods and things like that. I think probably, you know, as you're introing foods to like a baby or a an infant or a young like toddler-ish, like the main thing is that you want to continue experimenting with intros. Obviously there's different things that they direct you to, like, do things slowly at first, like one at a time, just to ensure tolerance. But I think as you're introing foods, like, that's going to play a huge role in developing the microbiome if you're giving them the right fibers and the right fuel over time. And I know, again, like, there's kids that are very picky and things like that, which, again, I don't have a kid yet, so I haven't experienced the fun of trying to get kids to eat certain things. But I will say, too, that just getting kids exposed to different things, even if they don't eat them, I think is really, really important. Some of the research on, like, kids and eating, like, trying to encourage kids to eat different fruits and vegetables, probably the best strategy is, like, non-food-based rewards. So, like, sometimes it's like, oh, if you eat this, you'll get this dessert or something like that. What they found is that it's probably better to do, like, stickers or, like, a prize or something if you're trying to encourage and getting the kid involved as much as possible. So having a couple options. So, like, okay, you get to have a fruit. Do you want blueberries, oranges, apples? Giving a few different options for them to choose is better. And then also, anytime you can get them involved in like the cooking or preparation of the process, I think the more they're likely to eat some of the foods. That's kind of what the research shows. Again, I haven't gone through this myself.
Yes. So I was going to share something. So Jess likes to get involved with food prep on occasion. She has to be in the mood, but...
And she's 5 or 6, right?
6, yeah.
Okay.
So just this past weekend, we were at my parents' house, and she was getting in my way. I was trying to make crab cakes, like, yeah. and I had like all of, like this like eggy, like crabby kind of batter, and my mom and dad and my husband were all sitting in the living room, and finally I had to like throw up the SOS signal. I was like, "Can somebody please help? Distract." So Grandma came in, and she's like, "Okay," because Jess was hell-bent that she was going to help with the prep, and it's like, at a certain point, now I just need to like form the patties and get them on the stove or the oven or whatever. And like, I didn't want her to make a huge mess with like the eggy kind of stuff that I was mixing up, because she was trying to mix it, and she mixed it, and a big glob of it went on the counter. Right. I was like, "Oh God, no, help!" So my mom comes in the kitchen, and she's like, "Okay, Jess, what do you want to do?" Well, like, trying to distract her, and Jess, all of a sudden, she goes, "I want to make my world famous salad."
Oh God.
Grandma, I make the world's best salads. And it's like, okay. And she'll get in this mood where she's like, "I make the world's best whatever," and we just go with it.
Right.
So she has like this little kid cutting board and knife and accessories. So thankfully I was able to do the crab cakes over at the stovetop, and I was happy over there. And my mom supervised as Jess made her world famous salad, which this time was not disgusting. Sometimes it is. This time it was cut up cucumbers, cut up strawberries, and some like arugula that she threw in there. And she served all of us salad, and it was very precious. But then I think she made like 3 bowls, and there was 4 of the adults, and she was trying to convince everybody to try it. So my mom and I both had a bowl, and Mike had already made his own salad, and he was like, "No, I'm good. I'm not going to have any salad." She was trying to pitch it to him. She was trying to sell it to him.
Right.
And she's like, "Well, if one of the girls, if they don't finish their salad, then you can have the rest of their salad." And my mom just is cracking up over the ground. She's like, "So your dad has to eat my leftovers if I don't finish it?" But anyway, I'll share. She one time made a salad, quote unquote. If I remember correctly, I think it was Cheerios, sunflower seeds, cucumber pieces, grapes, and I feel like there was one other random thing, like lemon juice or something. And she mixed it all up, and she pawns this off on you as her world famous salad, the best salad in the world. And we're just like, "Thanks."
Well, it tends to change. There isn't one formula, it sounds like.
I hope she serves me this one again, because the strawberries, cucumbers, and arugula actually worked, and I was cool with that. But the one prior to that was a little bit much. But yeah, I think that involving them in the cooking is helpful. I think having the options. I think also just like, I don't know if it's laziness or if it's like a parenting style, but we don't make like special stuff for her 99% of the time. Like, we cook dinner, and then, it's kind of like the old school, like 1950s parenting of like, "All right, this is dinner. I don't want that. I want, nah. Okay, well, you can take it or leave it. You can be hungry, whatever, man." And then we'll just eat our dinner. But, we do, we definitely have like friends and relatives who will go out of their way to like prepare a special meal or a special whatever for their kid, or like, "Oh, you don't want what we're having for dinner? Here, you can have a waffle, or you can have your Go-Gurt," or whatever it is. And we haven't done that personally. Again, I don't know if it's just that we're lazy and we don't want to make anything else, or if it's like a parenting style thing. But there have been times where Jess says she doesn't want something. We're like, "All right, man, cool, be hungry, whatever." And we eat our dinner, and then eventually she does come back around. It might take an hour or even 2 hours, or it might be right before bed that she announces that she's hungry and she wants her food after all. But generally speaking, when we've done that, she does come around and she does eat the food.
Right.
So.
Well, I think it's always good to, that your kid sees what you're eating too. That's something I have to discuss a lot with my husband because he tends to want to have his own unique, I'll make something that's better in general, from a nutrient standpoint, and then he'll be like, oh, I don't want the vegetable on the side. He'll refuse things because he's the pickiest grown man you'll ever meet. So he'll be like, I don't want to eat the vegetable that you're having on the side. So it will kind of be like training my husband and the child, but he's trying to get on board of so most of the time I'll make stuff and I'll be like, you have to have a little bit of it. It's literally like
a child.
It's like a practice. So he'll be like, fine. So then it's so funny. He'll always eat the vegetable first and shove it in, he's trying to just get it over with. Like
a child.
Yeah, he's so dramatic. But yeah, I think that you want to, the more you can demonstrate and eat different things and your child sees that you're eating different things. I know something we learned in RD school too is that it takes a while for kids to acquire a taste for things. So sometimes if you give them broccoli or something and they're absolutely not the first time, you have to keep giving it to them. I think it's it takes 13 to 15 times of exposure to a food for them to really be oh, I like this food. So again, sometimes with certain foods it takes a lot of repeating of things, which again would be annoying if the kid doesn't take it. And again, maybe somewhat wasteful if there's not a backup plan where you could where you could eat the food, No,
it's not. It's not wasteful. You will discover you end up eating a lot of leftovers as a parent.
Right.
Just all of the crap that your kid rejected and they didn't want to eat, you end up eating these weird hodgepodge meals and these weird hodgepodge snacks where you're like, all right, I guess I'll have 3 cucumber slices, a little bit of yogurt, and some baby carrots that my kid didn't eat. All right, that's cool.
Right. Well, and again, I think potentially incorporating some things again, if you're eating a diverse array of different plant foods, you're getting prebiotics in, but potentially eating some probiotic-rich type foods, either supplementally or, again, fermented foods, things like that, as long as they're well tolerated by the child, I certainly would encourage kind of eating some of those type foods as your kids.
Two things. Sorry to interrupt you yet again. 2 things that I have yet to con my child into eating. No matter, and I started trying this pretty early on, and she's outfoxed me. I haven't gotten her to take a shine to yogurt. And I've tried, for dairy-free for me, but I've even, bought her the regular yogurt. I've let her pick it out at the store.
Yeah.
She won't eat it. She'll pick it out and she'll bring it home, but she won't eat it.
Yeah.
And then smoothies. Freaking smoothies. Every other parent I know is well, at least I get vegetables in my child in the form of smoothies, because little Billy does smoothies like a champion. Right. And I'm I'll be damned if I can get my child to even look at a smoothie that I make. And I even tried to be a cool mom. For the record, let it stand. I tried to be a cool mom. I even, historically when I've made a smoothie, it's been everything but the kitchen sink goes into it. And it's avocado and cucumber and some apple and some carrots and some more, and all of the things.
Right.
I even simplified it and streamlined it. I was no, I just need to teach her that smoothies are good. So all I put in, frozen strawberries, banana, almond milk. That's it. It's like a freaking dessert.
Yeah.
And it's pink. She loves pink. I thought, this is going to sell it. She will not touch it. She will not even let it touch her lips.
Oh,
and then I drink it myself, and I'm oh, this is so good. You're missing out. It's like a dessert. No, she will not take the bait. She's going to be 30 by the time she has a smoothie, if she has her way. But, I even tried to make a sugary, fruity, delightful smoothie. I might have put collagen peptides in it, too, come to think of it. But anyway, no reason for her to dislike it. She will not even taste it. And I think it's just her flipping me the bird. Because she knows that I want her to try it.
Well, and I think it's so funny, too, the things that kids lock into randomly. The things that they will eat, and then also the things that they won't eat. I know my one niece was obsessed with raw onions for a period of time. No joke. She would sit and eat raw onions. Like, my sister-in-law would die laughing because she'd get her like some sort of sandwich and there'd be onions on it, or onions on the side. Like they would give like a little thing of onions. She would just sit and munch on the onions. Like that was her favorite thing of the whole thing. Like she would pick the onions off. And then my other niece on that side, so my brother's really big into gardening. So they would go and just pick stuff off the plants. So like he grew a lot of berries and like a lot of tomatoes. So like it would be funny because it would be like, they'd be two wandering around the garden like plopping stuff in their mouth. Like that you wouldn't typically see kids eating, like, what is it? Like the baby tomatoes.
Yeah.
She would be popping those in her mouth, like, and they eat berries. Like they'll destroy a whole thing of berries because of like just eating berries off the vine or whatever, off the bush. But again, it's funny like what kids get locked into and then what they also are like absolutely not. And you're like, this doesn't make sense that you wouldn't want this.
Yeah. Jess, we used to call her the paleo kid for a while.
Really?
Because she was super into meat.
Yeah.
Like, meat was always a big hit when she was like 2, 3, especially. We called her the paleo kid, and we'd be like, oh, yeah, she would demolish like a plate of steak.
Oh my gosh.
She's also done, it's funny too. I will share this also. As a parent, you have to surround yourself with some other parents for your own sanity, because you will go insane if you don't.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like, we have this idea of, like, what's normal, and we only ever can look at our own children to figure out, like, what's normal or what's okay.
Right.
And if you only have a small sample size, you're going to be making some incorrect conclusions. So I cannot tell. 6 times a year. It's not super frequent, but it's frequent enough. I catch my husband saying that our child is a picky eater and that she doesn't eat anything. And I have to go, stop. And I don't physically hit my husband, but I'm like, you can't say that. Like, we have a nephew who literally only eats like Go-Gurt, waffles, and bacon, and the occasional apple slice.
Right.
That's a picky eater. Our child eats broccoli, cabbage, salads, cucumber, strawberries. Like, she eats a lot of fruits and vegetables. There's a few that she's not keen on yet. Like, we make cauliflower a lot, and she won't do the cauliflower yet. We're like, whatever. She won't touch my smoothies with a 10-foot pole for some god unknown reason. But generally speaking, she's actually a pretty good eater. And I want to wring my husband's neck every time he says she's such a picky eater. She doesn't eat anything. Ugh. And it's like, no, you have to hang out with other children and other parents, because you will quickly see that our child is a really good eater. Right. And she actually gets way more variety and way more vegetable in her diet than a lot of other kids do. But like, if you only have the N=1 and you don't, like, my husband is the youngest of 2 children. And like the cousins that he's close with, like the one is older than him. Like he didn't grow up around kids. He doesn't have a big family full of kids. We don't live close to our niece and nephew. So like, really, our child is his first experience with a child. Honestly. Yay. So he makes these incorrect assumptions and says like, oh, she's such a picky eater. It's like, no, she's not. Stop.
Well, and I think too, like, one thing to point out about kids, because we learned this in school too, dietetic school, it's very normal for kids to have something called food jags, which is essentially just like they get really fixated on one food. So I've like seen this with my nieces, where like my niece, when she was like 2 or 3, it happens a lot during like toddlerdom or like from 2 to 4, sometimes even into 5. But like these food jags are essentially where they get locked in on like one food. It's all they want to eat. And this is kind of a normal part of development. Like, it's a pretty normal thing. Like, it's not abnormal at that age. But like, my niece was obsessed with baked beans. Like, so she'd be this little 2-year-old going, baked beans, I want baked beans. Like, she'd be wandering around my mom's house. Like, she knew that my mom always made her baked beans. And then she was obsessed with baked beans at her own house. There was this whole baked bean phase, but it was a very, like, food jag type reaction. And it's just, like, one of those things where, be patient with that, because it'll probably just go away. You could potentially do some things like, I was describing, like maybe have some prizes or something if they eat something else, and encourage them to eat a little bit more. But that kind of stuff is phasey. Like, there's phases that they're just going to go through with their eating, and keep that in mind. But I think generally probably setting a good example, eating a diverse array will probably set your child up to eat more diversity if they're seeing you do it. And again, that's such a key too. Again, I also think that there's parents too that are like, why isn't my kid eating vegetables and they're not eating vegetables or fruits? And it's like, because you're not eating vegetables. Like, there's there's not really like a strong example. And sometimes one of the best things you could do, not that you have to be a zealot and like only eat healthy foods, but setting the example of like, what does your plate look like, so that they get a good example of what they should be eating, because they're always watching, I feel like.
Oh, they are, in ways that you cannot even comprehend, honestly. Like, right, it's our 6-year-old outsmarts us a lot, and we're concerned for the teenage years, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But I think that setting a good example is really critical. I think also, like, working within their preferences. Like, if your kid just doesn't want the smoothies, like, I don't force the smoothies. Every couple of months, I'll try to, like, especially more in the summer when I'm making smoothies for myself, I'll offer it to her, but I never push it, because I know, at least with my daughter, if I push something, she's going to resist 3 times harder. And then I'm never going to get her to eat the damn thing. So I'd rather, like, offer it once. No? All right. And then I just enjoy the smoothie and I just move on with my life. Right. But
like, you don't want to create a scenario where the kid gets anxiety around eating. Yeah. Which happens, I think, if there's like a strong, like forcing, like, you have to do this right now. Yeah. You have to eat this before you can get up, or those types of things tend to backfire and create sort of more anxiety around food. But I think that I wanted to point out a few other things. I think getting outside more, getting exposed to microbes in the environment, so the more they can kind of be out in nature, getting dirty a little bit, interacting with other kids and animals, that kind of thing, you can get more microbial diversity from. Movement and exercise, I mean, all the things that tend to help create a good microbiome are probably going to do the similar thing in kids.
Getting enough sleep.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
I do think I want to touch on a little bit, like, if there is a particular issue, like with your child's gut health. Again, I probably have less experience with, like, babies that have things like reflux. I was just talking to a friend recently, and she's not positive, but, like, her baby is not eating, like, at all, like, kind of refusing to eat, even, like, formula, will not eat, and she's, like, very convinced it might be a reflux issue. Like, she screams, like, she just seems like she's in pain. But again, I have less experience with that sort of scenario of, like, reflux as a baby, or anything really baby-wise. I know things like for colic, there's certain research that probiotics might be helpful. But again, I have less data points for babies in gut health. I don't know if you have any, like, specific interventions for any issues at that point in time.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience personally or clinically, because Jess has been pretty healthy since she was born. But I will say, again, I think pediatric chiropractic is almost always worth looking into. Right. Sometimes you see a difference within one adjustment. Sometimes it takes a few treatments. but there's a website. So the ICPA is the organization that you'll look for. So the URL is ICPA, the number 4, kids.org. And if you go to that website, there's a button on the home screen that says find an ICPA chiropractor. That's what you want to look at. If there's some Jamo in your town who says, I could adjust children, but they have not taken coursework through the ICPA, I would not go to them personally. I would go to somebody who has done some of the coursework or has gotten certified through this organization. Because again, similar to medications, babies are not just tiny adults. Like they need to be adjusted differently, and not all chiropractors are going to know how to adjust children and babies. So I would take them to somebody who's certified through the ICPA. But I have heard colleagues talk an awful lot about they get pediatric patients come in and they either have reflux, difficulty latching, constipation, colic, and chiropractic reverses that and gets rid of those unwanted symptoms.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's one component. Food allergies and food sensitivities also can play a role. So sometimes, especially with reflux and colic, maybe a little bit less so with constipation, if the mom is breastfeeding, for example, and the mom is consuming dairy, and then the baby has a reaction to dairy, that can actually get through to the breast milk and cause a reaction in the baby. So there's definitely been scenarios, like I've seen this on mom groups, for example, where a mom finds that if she cuts dairy and soy out of her diet, then the baby's reflux goes away or the baby's, colic goes away. So I would also be open-minded to playing with the mom's diet if they're breastfeeding. If it's a formula scenario, then you could try to mix up the type of formula that you're giving them. And then chiropractic. Those would be my top 3 things probably to look into right out the get-go for babies, any sort of digestive complaints. There's a probiotic. It's the BioGaia brand. So
I actually have it here randomly. I got samples for my sister.
Oh, yeah.
Her baby was having some constipation issues. I don't even know if she ever tried it, but they sent a pretty big box, so I have it here.
Yeah,
but
they have the adult, the chewables, which, side note, tastes delicious. It's like tangerine and mint, which sounds like a really gross combination, but it's amazing. I'll eat those for treats sometimes. But to go back to that, but they have the baby BioGaia, and it's just the probiotic in some sort of carrier. I forget what the carrier is. I can grab it.
It's literally right here.
Yeah, and you can get it on Amazon, and obviously directly through the company as well. Yeah, exactly. It's that little bottle. It's 5 drops.
It comes in a little dropper.
Yeah, just like a little squeezy bottle. It's about a 1-month supply. Yep, exactly. And for the record, I have used that baby product with my adult patients before, because the chewable version of the BioGaia has a little bit of, I want to say maybe mannitol in it, ? Yeah. It has some sweetener that not everybody's going to tolerate perfectly. So for the people who are really cautious about fillers and sweeteners and stuff, if I want to get them on that probiotic, I'll just have them do the baby version. And we kind of laugh about it. You're a baby. Take your baby probiotic. But I've had several patients where they worked with me and then they became pregnant, they had a baby, and then it came up. Or close friends of mine who have had babies, and I've recommended that probiotic a good handful of times, and it really, really seems to help, particularly with the colicky kind of stuff.
Yeah. It's really good to know. I know, again, it sort of says for colic on the little packaging. It seems again, the strain is very well researched, too. So, yeah, I got it for my sister a while back, for kind of constipation. I'll have to ask her if she ever used it.
Yeah, it's a good product. I know there's another one, too. I don't think I have it handy. But I remember a really good friend of mine had a C-section with her son, who just turned 3. And I remember she was the one that I said had an oversupply issue and had mastitis.
Right.
And when she finally decided to cut herself some slack and stop
Yeah.
pumping and stop breastfeeding for her own mental health, they were supplementing with formula, which I think it was a goat's milk formula that they had shipped over from Europe. It was like a whole thing. But I remember one thing that she did that her integrative doctor, her integrative pediatrician recommended was there was some sort of probiotic that they recommended for her. And it wasn't BioGaia, but I don't remember the name of it now. So sorry. If anybody really is dying to know, leave a comment on the YouTube video version of this episode and I can ask her what it was because I'm sure that she'll be able to tell me what it was. But yeah, there are some probiotics. BioGaia is just the one that I've used the most. And actually, I'm going to text her right now and see if I get a response by the end of this episode.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder a little bit too. I know some of the formulas are adding oligosaccharides into the mix of the formulas. Again, they're adding different prebiotics in, which I think is really interesting. I don't know, again, like the exact match of that to like the human oligosaccharide that's in breast milk. But I think there's going to be some benefit from that for the microbiome if they're adding in some of these prebiotics in to kind of mimic what you're getting from the breast milk to some capacity. I'm curious, like for older kids, because again, like I've sort of worked with, I think the youngest I've worked with was a 4-year-old. But generally I've kind of seen a little bit of a gamut. So I've seen more teens, I would say, than anything else. But like, one thing I will say, if I'm working with kids that are younger, especially younger than like 12 and under, but even teens, I would be more cautious. You know, I think there has to be some degree of trying to preserve gut microbes, like more so. I think we're generally slated to do that even in adults too. Like, what's going to be the solution that causes the least collateral damage? But I see, like, some of these parents who, you know, they're doing, like, a breath test, which kind of makes me wonder again, like, I don't know if we should be interpreting breath tests differently based on, you know, a kid taking it. Smaller anatomy. Also, are they taking the test right? Like, if you have a 4-year-old taking a breath test, are they really able to follow the directions properly? To no fault of their own, they're 4. But again, even like an 8-year-old I could see struggling with, you know, following breath test directions.
Even I was confused when I did one a while back. Like, I read the directions and I looked at the picture and I was like, okay, so I have to breathe, but not too hard. But also, like, it has to be one continuous breath, and I can't. I remember, like, being nervous. I was like, I don't know if I'm going to do this right. Okay, here goes nothing. Right. And I'm in my 30s. So, you know, I can't imagine trying to get a kid to do a breath test. Side note, before I lose this train of thought, though, I don't want to interrupt you again. My friend actually already texted back.
Oh, dang. So
before we get too far from that topic, so the other probiotic that parents maybe would look into is called eVivo. EVIVO. That was the one that they gave their son. And the logic was the integrative pediatrician recommended that one because he was born via C-section. I don't know a lot about like the research that one has behind it or how good it is, but they seem to think it was pretty legit. And I will say their 3-year-old is very happy and healthy and thriving and doing well. But yeah, I wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think that, you know, I think that we should be way more cautious and potentially do things that are a bit more focused on rebuilding and see sort of how things shake out. Like, even if someone gets diagnosed with SIBO as a child, what I've seen some functional practitioners doing, like when I've inherited the client from other functional practitioners, it seems very aggressive. For, you know, a 4-year-old or a 10-year-old to be doing kind of the type of regimen that I've seen them doing. And again, from my standpoint, you know, you don't want to do too many things while the microbiome's developing to just like knock it out. Same thing again, like maybe not to quite the extent. I mean, some of them are taking rifaximin and things like that many times over, which I don't think's great. But, I think that the same reason why you wouldn't want to take antibiotics like willy-nilly is the same reason why you wouldn't want to do like herbs willy-nilly or high doses of things.
Or restrictive diets, like low FODMAP.
Right. And that's such a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. I've had clients where, like, their parents, like, well-intentioned.
Yeah.
But they're on, like, a specific carbohydrate diet. I'm, like, looking at their diet, and it's low carb, probably under where they need to be calorie-wise. And it's like, your kid is developing. Like, this, we need to make sure that they're getting enough nutrition. It's more important than anywhere else in the developmental timeline. And again, it's already problematic when adults aren't necessarily able to nourish their bodies properly. But, like, when you have a kid, you need to be really careful what you're doing nutrition-wise. Because, again, it could affect their development long-term, too. Especially if they're deficient in certain macronutrients and even micronutrients. Again, the more you narrow, the higher the degree of the micronutrient issues that could develop. So again, I've seen some, like, I don't even know how to describe it. It was all well intentioned, but I think it makes me especially nervous when you're going on the hyper restrictive type scenarios.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, it's funny. In this instance, I think this is the first time in 70 whatever episodes this is. I think we've had opposite experiences for once, clinically.
Oh, really?
So you've had cases where the parents have restricted the child's diet, for SIBO or whatever it might be. I don't think I've seen that, but I've seen the opposite where the parents are not willing to change the diet. No way, no how. And, there's been, I can think of a couple of families right off the top of my head where I could tell them the reasons and I could justify it and I could explain it until I'm blue in the face. And I just knew that when they came back in a month later or whatever it might have been, when we followed up the next time, I knew damn well they wouldn't do it. And I remember this one family, the child, among other stuff, had really bad ADHD, and they were trying to help him with his ADHD. And I think he also had, like, really inflamed tonsils, and they were hoping to avoid getting his tonsils taken out. And I remember saying, all right, look, obviously I didn't say it this way, but all right, look, gluten and dairy sensitivities are so common, especially amongst kids with ADHD. Why don't you try it out? And this particular child had a dairy allergy when he was a kid. And then the parents had said that he had outgrown it. He was like, 11 or 12, I think. The mom had like 5 autoimmune diseases. The mom had done AIP. Like, she was well versed enough that she knew where to find the gluten in the dairy, And I explained the reasoning, the rationale. I think we actually had some fresh blood work that confirmed he was still having an allergy type reaction to gluten and dairy both, if I remember correctly. Every single appointment without fail did not change the diet. And they would say things like, well, I'd say, oh, how's the gluten-free, dairy-free thing going? And I wasn't setting the bar high. She could have fed him gluten-free, dairy-free Pop-Tarts for all I cared. Right. I just wanted to do an experiment and see if that made a difference. And I would ask her whenever we would follow up, like, oh, so how is that going? And she'd be like, yeah, good. We've been gluten and dairy-free. Well, he did have ice cream last week. Oh, and he did have a hot dog bun with like a regular hot dog bun. Oh, and we did have pizza 2 nights ago. Oh, right. And we did have this. And it was like, okay, he wasn't really gluten and dairy-free then.
Right.
But it made me want to rip my hair out by the roots. Because I was like, I have the knowledge to help this kid. And they're not taking the bait. Like, they're not doing it. Like, why are you paying me? Right. So, anyway. I no longer work with pediatric cases, actually. So, I have not had an experience like that in a while because I simply
Right.
don't work with children anymore. But that was immensely frustrating for a whole different reason. Like, I was setting the bar low. Like, you go get him gluten-free, dairy-free crackers for all I care. But just see if it helps, and then you can make the decision whether or not it's worth it to stick with it. But my
Right.
goodness gracious, folks. But
Yeah.
I'll share this too, though, to kind of zoom back out, because that was, there's like the two flavors of the nutritional thing. I think still trying to encourage fruit and vegetable intake, trying to make sure that they're like eating regularly and eating healthy meals for the most part is reasonable. I will say too, like every now and then my daughter will have a little bit of a tummy ache, and it's never anything profound. Half the time I wonder if she's stalling because she doesn't want to take a shower, to be
Mhm.
truthful, but like I can't say that, not to her. But you know, I found that chamomile tea has been really, really helpful for her. And actually, I've gotten her to a point where now, if she has a tummy ache, she specifically asks me for chamomile tea. So I just, I keep a bag of the loose chamomile at home, and then I'll put it in like a little tea strainer basket and make the tea. I put like a little bit of lemon in it for her. She usually requests lemon with it, but she'll sip on that, and then 20, 30 minutes later, I'll ask her, hey, how's your tummy? And she'll say, oh, it's all better. It's good. So,
Yeah.
chamomile, great for the really young and the really old and everybody in between, for that matter.
Yeah. Well, and a couple things to add to that. Again, I think going more the conservative route by experimenting with probably probiotics, prebiotics, if someone's having things like constipation or diarrhea or like some of these more common GI pain, like IBS type symptoms, as and again, what might make sense might depend on the person, and you probably want to work with someone to develop like an actual strategy.
Yep.
Um, but, I would probably do more gentle stuff first and
Yep.
foremost. And again, I kind of am that way with my adult clients too, but especially with kids. Um, the other thing I wanted to add to what you're saying, and again, this sort of is talking about the dietary side of things. I have seen the couple, again, I haven't worked extensively with like teens, but I will say the food relationship issues come up a lot more with teens. So there's been a few teen clients where I've seen definite signs of disordered eating, and it's been something that's been a little bit harder to overcome. Um, I've had I've had a teen client who was having all these gut symptoms, and it could have been being aggravated by not getting enough calories in. So it's like a very hard scenario because you have to build up calories, which then might rev up symptoms a little bit more until they get to that threshold, until symptoms resolve. But again, they would make very subtle comments, and again, you have to kind of clue in on them. But it would be like, "Oh, I get really nervous when my body changes," or like kind of these little subtle things that you might miss if you're just kind of paying attention to
Yeah.
some of the gut stuff. But I definitely think in teens, especially teen girls, certainly could be teen guys too, but I've seen working with teen girls that there oftentimes is a higher tendency for disordered eating, and it could be a bigger factor to pay attention to as a parent, um, and to try to kind of maybe approach that delicately or build some understanding around it because again, it could be a big culprit of gut dysfunction if they're undernourishing. And again, a lot of it's related in the body image stuff, and then it kind of overlaps into like, oh, now I have gut symptoms and I have to control those. So it can sort of spiral a bit, but it's another reason to be really cautious about restricting with kids because they're developing their relationship with food and what that looks like. And it could play into something that might already be there. Uh, so just being cautious of not overly restricting especially in certain teen populations where I think it's way more prevalent for disordered eating patterns to start to develop.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a really good point. We have that great episode about disordered eating with Elena Kunicki back, I don't even know, like 40 episodes ago. But if you guys haven't checked out that episode, it was really, really fantastic. And she talked about when she was struggling with her binge eating and her disordered eating, she had IBS symptoms. And
Yeah.
I think she was diagnosed and labeled with IBS, and it was really just because of the binge eating and the cycling. But yeah, I think that is a valid point. I will also add that if you, the parent, have disordered eating and a crappy relationship with food, guess what? Your little sponges that live with you, your kids, they're going to pick up on that. It's not to say it's guaranteed, because honestly, I grew up with a mom who was obese or morbidly obese all of my childhood, and she was doing MetaFast and Weight Watchers and all of these things trying to lose weight, and she yo-yo dieted for all of my childhood, and I never picked up on any sort of disordered eating behavior from her miraculously. But I have worked with teenage patients. You know, I'll generally work with kids, quote unquote, if they're like 16, 17, 18, where they're more independent, they have more autonomy, and I can kind of explain things. I think the key is if the kid is old enough that I can have the appointment with the kid and not have the appointment with the parent, then I will work with them. But if they're young enough that like I'm really having an appointment with the parent, then I generally don't work with that young population anymore. But, you know, in like my 16, 17, 18-year-old kids, I've seen numerous examples where we eventually kind of uncover that their disordered eating was originally rooted in observing their mom or a parent figure who had disordered eating. So, you know, for what it's worth, if you have your own food issues, now might be the time to try to rein that in and work with somebody like a therapist or do hypnotherapy or do something to try to work on your relationship with food. I will also throw out, you know, kind of along the same lines in the sense of a really tough conversation that probably nobody wants to think about or talk about. In my opinion, if a child is diagnosed with IBS, and definitely if that kid is diagnosed with SIBO, you have to think of stress or abuse or trauma as a root cause. There's not a lot of reasons why a kid should develop SIBO. If you think about the SIBO root causes, I mean, maybe the PPIs or the H2 blockers, maybe the kid had reflux as a baby, and they were on H2 blockers or PPIs from a young age. But aside from that, there's not a lot of really valid reasons why a child would develop SIBO, especially. So you've got to keep your wits about you. You know, think about, is the home environment stressful? Are they really stressed out? Do you put a lot of pressure on the kid to get good grades? Do you put a lot of pressure on them to be a good kid in whatever way you mean that? You know, do the parents or the parent figures fight at home? Is there a lot of tension? Are there just a lot of negative comments and snarkiness and bitterness and resentment in the home? Could somebody have been physically assaulting the child or abusing the child? Has there been any sort of trauma? Like, you've got to really try to be objective and honest and look at these things, or work with somebody who can help you evaluate that, because that is a really big root cause. And I think that it would explain, not all, but a pretty shocking number of kids that get diagnosed with SIBO in their childhood, and even honestly into the teen years too. Like sexual abuse, like it happens, and it can happen all running up all through the teen years. So keep your eyes peeled and just make sure that they have the space to talk to somebody about that and get them the help if they need the help.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I do think, you know, there are interesting stats about, even if you had childhood trauma and now you're an adult, that increases in a big way your chances of IBS and dysfunction gut-wise.
Yep.
So again, if you're, it's only makes sense that if there is trauma going on, that it could lead to something like SIBO even early on.
Yeah. So I think, again, it's like, what's behind door number 3? Like, nobody wants to look behind door number 3, but you've got to do it. If you're really trying to help your kid and get to the root causes, if they have been diagnosed with with SIBO certainly, but also to a degree IBS. You've got to look for that kind of stuff, and it sucks going through that, but it is what it is. I'll throw out there also, this is a good hodgepodge episode, I feel like, because
we said, this might be a shorty, and then of course it's long. It's
not, no. But I'll throw out there some other tools. So I like to sneak things in my daughter's food as much as possible. I have a very strong-willed child, so the more I can sneak things into her food without her knowing about it, the better. Yeah. For example, the probiotics, the BioGaia probiotics, no flavor whatsoever, none. Like, even I used it a little bit when I was breastfeeding her, and I would just put the drop of the probiotic and the drop of vitamin D right on my nipple before she latched. Worked like a charm, no taste.
Right.
Sometimes I'll sneak things, especially like oatmeal is a really good vessel. So I'll put like a scoop or two of collagen peptide powder, like the Vital Protein stuff. I'll put that into like oatmeal or, anything that has that kind of consistency where I can mix something into it. 2 prebiotics that you could play with. One is the beloved inulin that we have mentioned time and again on this podcast. It's very FODMAPy, so just go slow. Like, don't load them up with a tablespoon all of a sudden. Right. Start with a small dose and then gradually increase, but it dissolves like you wouldn't believe. Just mix it with a little bit of water or juice or something and they won't even know it's in there. And then going back, this might be especially relevant for kids who weren't breastfed or were only partially breastfed, but they have this Holy Ghost 2FL supplement now in the US. I think Culturelle has their own brand of it now, but this 2FL supplement is one of the oligosaccharides that's found in human breast milk. So it specifically feeds bifidobacteria, but what the Holy Ghost product is, it comes in these little satchels, and you break it open. You can mix it with water. So like if you're giving it to a kid, you could mix it with food or water. It's just a little bit sweet, but there's not much of a taste to it, honestly. Just for what it's worth, if I ever take this myself, I just open up the little packet and I dump it in my mouth and then I drink water because it's pleasant tasting. It's just a little bit sweet, but it doesn't have much of a flavor to it. So I just dump the whole thing in my mouth and then I take a sip of water.
Does it taste as good as Foss?
No.
Okay.
But it's not far off. Honestly, like, it's not as enjoyable as inulin. It's also not as, like, you know how once you kind of get the inulin in your mouth and you start to salivate a bit, the saliva kind of starts to dissolve it and it turns into something that's a bit chewy? Mm-hmm. This doesn't ever do that. It doesn't get chewy like inulin does. It would never get stuck in your teeth, for example. It's a little bit grainy, just ever so slightly grainy when you take it the way I do. But it's that little subtle bit of sweetness, kind of closer, I would say, in consistency and sweetness to glycine, if you've ever taken glycine as a standalone powder supplement. But it's perfectly fine and doesn't taste weird or bad at all. So, but you could put this easily in food. You could probably sneak in other fibers like acacia fiber or PHDG or other stuff, but I think both of these would be masked very well in children's food, and they would be none the wiser.
Yeah, for sure. Cool.
Yeah. Well, I think that's almost a wrap. I will also throw out there that, remember, vitamin D is pretty important for your body and its ability to manage its microbial load. So, similarly, don't forget to give your kiddos vitamin D. Personally, what I do with my daughter is I have just like a vitamin D, vitamin K2 liquid. I forget if I have Thorne or Orthomolecular. It's one of those liquid products. And when she was a baby, I would give her 1 drop. Again, I would put it on my nipple, or I would put it like on the nipple of the bottle that we were using, and I would give her like 1 drop or about 1,000 IUs per day. Sometimes I would skip a day here or there, so I didn't mind giving her a little bit of a higher dose. And then now that she's 6, I mean, I'll give her anywhere from like 2,000 to 4,000 IUs per day. Again, I'm not consistent every single day, but most days of the week I'm giving her a couple of drops of the vitamin D. But that's going to influence their ability to manage their microbes and manage their critters. So,
yeah,
pretty pretty big when you're talking about gut stuff, certainly, and infections. Yeah. And if you can prevent infections, whether it be ear infections, staph, strep, UTI, whatever, if you can prevent some infections with vitamin D, then that's going to lessen the amount of antibiotics that they have to have over their lifetime, which will also be protective for the gut.
Yes.
All right, my darling. I think that's all I've got. I think the wisdom...
I think my brain has pooped out as much as it can poop out.
Well, that's a charming way to think of it. Well, guys, I'll leave you with that visual of Amy's brain pooping out the knowledge for you to enjoy. So take that for what it is. As always, thank you so much for tuning in for the IBS Freedom Podcast. We hope your favorite podcast. We know it is. Wink, wink. You don't have to tell us. But if you want to tell us in the comments down below on YouTube, please feel free. We are not immune to flattery. As always, we'll see you in the next episode where we have more great topics, more great knowledge, and guests and fun and awesomeness coming your way. And pregnancy updates, I'm sure, from Miss Amy. But Thank you so much. Like and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Like the video, drop a comment down below. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, give us a 5-star review, please. Thank you. Only if you feel we deserve it, though.